Okay, so today, for our lesson, I'm going to be teaching a history lesson over racial segregation, important dates about it, when the I'm going to be teaching about like the John Crow laws, um, and just stuff around that lines. So, slavery officially ended in 1865 on December 6th. Um, and this was like when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed and it was ratified and signed. And um, so John Crow laws began in the late 1865, and they were meant to establish separate but equal conditions. Now, these laws made it legally acceptable to force African Americans to use separate washrooms, transportation, water fountains, entrances, and even go to different schools. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court as long as the conditions that they were in were separate. Um, Even if they were separate, they were still equal. Now, these were not upheld very well. So it would be like, um, me because I decide, I like red. So I am going to give you a big note card that you can write um, all the test answers you want, front and back, and you can fill it up with anything you want. And then it would be like if like you two students because you're both wearing green, if I well, let's say like I only have this one note card to give you, and I mean, um, I go ahead and I just fold the note card, rip it in half, and I give it to just both of you. So you guys have now less than half of a note card. Um, but you guys both still have a note card, and that's what these conditions were like. And a lot of the time, like African American schools were vandalized and destroyed. Um, so in 1954, just a little under 100 years after that, the Supreme Court had actually ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that educational segregation was unconstitutional. And this brought an end to like the whole separate but equal. Um, Separate but equal in education. Um, so now I have another example for you guys. So let's say, um, because you're still wearing a red shirt. So I give you this full piece of paper, and I tell you to crumple it up in the biggest ball you can. But it has to be tight, obviously, or else you would just like crumple it and call that good. And let's say because you're wearing green, I give you like this half piece of paper, and then I give you um like this little piece of paper. You all are getting paper, but obviously like your piece of paper is going to be a lot bigger than your piece of paper will be. Then especially like, you know, your piece of paper will be. Um and I mean that's what these conditions were like, and that's why especially why educational segregation had to end, because not only were black schools being vandalized, there were students who may have lived right down the street from a school, but because it was a whites only school, they had to either walk or, I mean, find some form of transportation to get all the way down, to the other um, sorry, to get to the school, that's across town because that is a black only school or African American school. Um, so that's why the Supreme Court, found that ruling. Now, before this, there was a very kind of there violent groups of people were, kind of on the rise, especially at the beginning of like these Jim Crow laws and the beginning of right after slavery ended. They would attack and they would torture African Americans at night. Um, Now, the most violent group of these were a group of Ku Klux Klan, and they were a group of ex Confederate veterans. There were, I mean, people in it that were of like some of the highest government officials, and then some like that had like really bad criminal backgrounds. And I mean, they would terrorize these African American families. They would, I mean, and this would be all done at night so that you couldn't see them. We can see pictures nowadays of people being, just tortured and like hanged by these by this group of people that just didn't like that they could no longer have control over them. So in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act, which legally ended segregation. African Americans, they could no longer be forced to have to go to a different transportation site or go use a different restroom or like use a separate water fountain. Because especially like the problem with these that we've seen is though that this place, they decide, well, we'll hire you. And then, you take the job as an African American, and halfway through your shift, you have to go use the restroom. You go to find a restroom, and you find out that it's, either across the street or 3 blocks down. So a lot of these places just weren't equipped to, fairly have separate but equal conditions. So then in 1965, 100 years later, after slavery had officially ended, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and this had halted efforts to keep like minorities from voting, because an African American, they'd go up to vote and they'd be turned away, and like either just not allowed to vote at that stand or like couldn't pass like whatever test they were given, or not being able to like register. And then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act ended discrimination when buying, selling, or renting a house. And that was that had to be passed because, these African American families were being forced to have to rent and buy and these houses in very poor conditions by like railroad tracks or like in very like not very safe neighborhoods where you wouldn't want like your children growing up in. They wanted to be able to have a better life for them, but then like these agencies or people would just discriminate against them because of just because they're African Americans. Now, I've used that word a lot, discriminate, but what does it actually like fully mean? Because I haven't given you guys the definition of it yet. So the like book Merriam-Webster definition is the unjust the unjust treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, or sex. So basically, like, we don't see it as open in today's world, but back then it was very prevalent. It was very open, especially by like those groups that are going and violently attacking people of color. So yeah, and I mean, now we see it different ways. We see it through people of, yes, we still see it of people through color, or we see it through, people of, with disabilities, or just kind of really anything. So yeah, that was the end of my lesson. Yeah, I know that this was like about 9 minutes and 18 seconds, approximately. I would imagine like that the activities would take just slightly longer. That way, just because like I didn't have an audience that was comfortable with being recorded with Zoom and everything. So, um, yeah.